Good morning, everybody. This is the Mack Road Church of Christ Sunday Samuel to Chronicle study. We're in 1 Samuel chapter 3, and down at verse 14. If you need to reach me, there's my email address. So you can reach me if you'd like to. I'll constantly remind you of just the kind of major outline of the book by looking at this chart that you have here, 1 Samuel. This is a chart from Jensen's, who had a lot of charts. And remember that we're looking at Samuel. We're in this first section here where we have Samuel, the prophet, priest, and the judge. And we're going to notice that we had the birth of and call of Eli right here. And this is where we're at. We're getting ready to get into the judgeship of Eli. Now, of Samuel. When we talk about the judges of Israel, we're not talking about judges like you and I think of it, not usually. You and I think of a judge as, you have a case before somebody, so you go to the courts, and the courts will settle it for you. And certainly they did that from time to time, but that's not really the kind of judges that were set up during the judges system. The judges that were set up during the judges system were more judges from the standpoint that they brought judgment on a nation or on a country that was oppressing Israel. So whenever Israel would sin and leave God, God would allow a country to come and subjugate them. And then when they repented and they turned back to God, God would raise a judge. And the judge would go out and basically fight against that nation that was oppressing them. And so when we talk about the judgeship of Samuel, that's what we're talking about. We're talking about the fact that he would go out and fight against those nations that came up against Israel. Now, that doesn't mean that he didn't sit from time to time on a court and maybe decide some decisions. But it was more from the standpoint that he would administer the law and tell the people what the law is so that they could do it. So we're right here in this section here where we're going from Samuel's birth and call by God to where he's going to bring a judgment on Israel. And then we're going to see that that's going to last for a little bit up to chapter 8 when they ask for a king. But that's where we're at now. So just kind of keep that in mind as we take a look at the book of Samuel. As we do that, here is our e-sword, and we're in 1 Samuel chapter 3. We're down here at verse 15. Remember that Samuel had just been told by God, or had just been called by God in a vision. And he was told some things that were going to happen to Israel because of their wickedness and sinfulness. And therefore, God was going to bring judgment on the house of Eli, and not only on the house of Eli, but also on Israel, because they hadn't really been serving the Lord or doing what was right, especially since they had Eli's sons who were in the priesthood, and they were sleeping with the women that came to the door, and they were eating of the fat that was only supposed to be offered to God, and they were causing the people to give them their meat before it had been boiled. And so they weren't very, very spiritual-minded individual. Eli, you might say, might have been a little spiritual-minded, but his weakness for his sons caused him his difficulties and his problems. And so what we find out here then in 1 Samuel 3 and 15 is that after God appeared to Samuel and gave him that message about what was going to happen to Eli and Israel, it says in verse 15, so Samuel laid down until morning. And then he opened the doors of the house of the Lord, but Samuel was afraid to tell the vision to Eli. Now, it's interesting that here you have a young man, and I don't know how old he is, but he's certainly old enough to receive a vision. He's old enough to be in charge of opening and closing the doors of the house of God. And so at least he's a teenager and maybe a little bit older than that. And God just appeared to him. And rather than him running out and telling his friends or running out and telling people that he had a revelation from God, he kept it to himself. And no doubt, probably one of the reasons that he did was because it wasn't a favorable message for Eli. And Eli was still, as far as he was concerned, considered his adopted dad. And so he certainly didn't want to bring that news to Eli, but he kept it to himself. And I find that interesting that he wouldn't, tell somebody as soon as he woke up, hey, the Lord appeared to me and gave me a message. But it's interesting, and I think that's part of the character of Samuel. Samuel wasn't going to do anything that he didn't think the Lord wanted him to do. And that's certainly a good thing. So Samuel lay down till morning. And he opened the doors of the house of the Lord, but Samuel was afraid to tell the vision to Eli. Then Eli called Samuel and said, Samuel, my son. And he said, here I am. He said, what is the word that he spoke to you? Please do not hide it from me. May God do so to you, and more also, if you hide anything from me of all the words that he spoke to you. So Samuel told him everything and hid nothing from him. And he said, it is the Lord. Let him do what seems good to him. Thus Samuel grew in the Lord Thus Samuel grew, and the Lord was with him, and let none of his words fail. All Israel from Dan even to Beersheba knew that Samuel was confirmed as a prophet of the Lord. And the Lord appeared again at Shiloh, because the Lord revealed himself to Samuel at Shiloh by the word of the Lord. And so what you have here in this case then is you have Samuel laying down. Then, of course, after he gets the vision, he lays down. And the next day he wakes up and he goes about his usual business, which is opening the doors of the house of the Lord. And so he would open the doors in order for people to be allowed in. But Samuel, it says, was afraid to tell Eli what he had heard. And so God in the vision, or at least in the revelation, as far as I know, didn't tell Samuel that he was supposed to tell Eli. He didn't say, Samuel, now as soon as you get up, you go tell Eli what I've said. He just told Samuel what was going to happen. And so he was afraid to tell Eli anything. So verse 16 says, then Eli called Samuel and said, Samuel, my son. And he said, here I am. And he said, what is the word that he spoke to you? Now remember that when that was going on the night before, that Samuel had run into Eli every time the Lord said, Samuel ran to Eli because he thought Eli was calling him. And so finally, the third time, Eli said, next time it happens, or the third time, he said, next time it happens, say, your servant is listening, Lord. And so Eli knew that God was talking to Samuel. And so no doubt would want to know what was spoken. And so that's what he asked him. He says, what is the word that he spoke to you? He says, please, in verse 17, please do not hide it from me. May God do so to you. And more also, if you hide anything from me of all the words that he spoke to you. So Eli basically told Samuel that he needed to tell him, and that if he didn't tell him, that God would basically punish him, or the message that was for Eli would then be given to him, or would be accomplished by him. But nonetheless, he was certainly eager to find out what the message was, and didn't want Samuel to be afraid to tell him anything that God had told him. Now, I'm positive that had God said to Samuel, don't tell anybody, that even though Eli threatened him, he wouldn't have told him. But Eli didn't know what God had said. And so when he asked, he just wanted to make sure that everything that God told him, that Samuel would relate to him. And that's basically what you have going on there. And so it says in verse 18, so Samuel told him everything and hid nothing from him. So Samuel went ahead and told Eli everything God said about him personally, about his sons, about the priesthood, about the ark, everything that God had said to Samuel. Samuel told Eli and willingly told him, but he didn't tell him until Eli asked him to tell him. Now here's Eli's response, and he said, it is the Lord. Let him do what seems good to him. Now, I find that interesting that Eli says, it is the Lord, let him do what seems good to him, as if God wouldn't do what is good to him, what was good to him. In other words, what was beneficial for God as far as God is concerned. And so it's kind of funny that he says, it is the Lord, let him do whatever seems good to him. And so I take that to mean not that Eli was permitting God to do what God was going to do as if Eli could stop him, but was basically acknowledging the fact that God is going to do whatever God says, and Eli is going to accept it. There's always two ways that you can accept God's will. there's always two ways that you can react to God's will. One is you can accept it and take it no matter what it might be. Or two, you can try to balk from it. You can try to run from it, or you can try to deny it or act like it's not going to happen. But the Lord's will be done. It will be accomplished. And so it's always best to go along with the Lord instead of trying to fight against the Lord, because you're going to end up losing. And so Eli went ahead and said, let him do what seems good to him. So Eli was willing to accept whatever consequences were going to be measured out. Now, remember I told you that as parents, it's our job to make sure that we give consequences to our children when they do things wrong, so that they realize that doing wrong leads to bad consequences. And it's easier to teach them when they're younger than it is when they're older. And so now God is going to step in the picture, because God is going to make sure that Eli's children, Eli's sons, which by the way aren't children now, but they're Eli's children, these men are going to be disciplined and are going to receive the consequences of their action. If God didn't do anything, then it would look like God doesn't care. Eli doesn't care. And so since Eli doesn't care, God's going to show you that he cares. And if Eli's not willing to do what's supposed to be done, God will. And that's what we need to remember. When God tells us to do something, it's going to be accomplished. God is going to accomplish what God says. So we can either help God in the accomplishment of those things, or we can fight against him. And you don't want to be caught fighting against God. And so that's what you have here. Now, in contrast to Eli's sons and Eli's problems, it says in verse 19, and thus Samuel grew, and the Lord was with him, and let none of his words fail. Now, I want you to notice that. And I also want you to notice verse 20, which says, and all Israel from Dan even to Beersheba knew that Samuel was confirmed as a prophet. So when it says here that Samuel grew and the Lord was with him, certainly it's indicating that he grew in his stature, but it's also indicating that he grew in his relationship with God. And when it says God was with him, that's his spiritual relationship. So he was physically growing, and becoming a man, and he was also having a relationship with God. But what I want you to notice is it says, and the Lord was with him, and let none of his words fail. And as a result of that, all of Israel knew that he was a prophet. Now, I want to stop here for just a minute and get you to understand something about prophets. Prophets in the Bible who were speaking for God, their words never failed. Their words were accomplished. And matter of fact, when God was talking to Israel, when he was about ready to bring them into the land of the promised land, he knew that they would be asking, how is God going to talk to us, or how are we going to communicate with God? Notice that in Deuteronomy chapter 18, and down here at about verse 12, or actually let's start here with verse 10. God is pointing out to Israel that when they go into the promised land and they start their new land, their new nation, verse 10 of Deuteronomy 18, just Deuteronomy 18:10, it says, there shall not be found among you anyone who makes his sons or his daughters pass through the fire, one who uses divination, one who practices witchcraft, or who interprets omens, or a sorcerer, or one who casts a spell, or a medium, or a spiritist, or one who calls up the dead. Now, God points out that when Israel goes into the land, they're supposed to, of course, kill all the Canaanites, and they're not supposed to do what the Canaanites did in their supposed communications with God, with their God, with false gods. And that was that they would pass their sons and daughters through the fire when they worship Moloch, and they would use diviners, in other words, people who would read, stones or chicken legs or blood, or all of those different practices, and people who were witches or interpreted omens. And so those are all things that have to do with communicating with the spirit world or with their gods. And so Israel, no doubt, would want to communicate with God. So the question is, how was that going to be done? Verse 12 says, for whoever does these things is detestable to the Lord, and because of these detestable things, the Lord, your God, will drive them out before you. That's why the Canaanites were kicked out of the land. You shall be blameless before the Lord your God. For those nations which you shall dispossess, listen to those who practice witchcraft and to diviners. But as for you, the Lord your God has not allowed you to do so. So the question comes down to, well, then how do we communicate with you, God? How do you talk to us? Do they have to run? For example, if somebody lived up in the area of Galilee, do they have to run all the way down to Jerusalem in order to find out what God said? How in the world was God going to communicate to them? Well, verse 15 tells us that. He says, the Lord your God will raise up for you a prophet like me from among you. From your own countrymen, you shall listen to him. This is in accordance to all that you asked of the Lord your God in Horeb on the day of the assembly, saying, let me not hear again the voice of the Lord my God. Let me not see his great fire anymore, or I will die. And the Lord said to me, they have spoken well. I will raise up a prophet from among their countrymen like you, and I will put my words in his mouth, and he shall speak to them all that I commanded him. Now, we understand that that little reference about a prophet that's like Moses is actually talking about Jesus and the coming of Jesus. And we know that Jesus didn't show up for a number of years from the time that Israel went and gained access to the land of Israel, but they still needed to be able to communicate with God. But what I want you to notice is that what he says is, in verse 19, it says, it shall come about that whoever will not listen to my words, which he shall speak in my name, I will require it of him. And then he gives him general instructions about a prophet. He says, but the prophet who speaks a word presumptuously in my name, which I have not commanded him to speak, or which he speaks in the name of other gods, that prophet shall die. So God points out that he has prophets, and his prophets are supposed to speak his words. Now, I want you to notice verse 21. He says, you may say in your heart, how will we know the word which the Lord has not spoken? In other words, how do we know which prophet is really from God? He says, when a prophet speaks in the name of the Lord, if the thing does not come about or come true, that is the thing which the Lord has not spoken. The prophet has spoken it presumptuously. You shall not be afraid of him. And so basically what God told them was, the way that you're going to know my prophets from other prophets is that my prophets are actually going to say things that are actually going to happen. They're not going to fail. None of it is going to fail. Now, I have heard about individuals who claim to be prophets, and they claim that God is talking to them, and that they come and talk to people, and they say that they're not always right. And I've even heard some claim that there are individuals, or that there are schools or places you can go to learn how to be a prophet, and that sometimes those individuals who are learning how to be prophets will prophesy stuff, and it won't come to pass. And they say, well, they're just young prophets. They don't really know anything yet. They're trying out their prophet wings, you might say. And so the idea is that according to these people, that a prophet can be a prophet even though his words don't come to pass. Even though his words say one thing, he can still be a prophet even if it isn't accomplished. And that's what you have today in the religious world. You have a number of religious groups that are following leaders who've made prophecies and predictions that haven't come true, but they still follow them as prophets. God's prophets, a true prophet, whatever he says is from God. And when God says something, it's going to come to pass. It will happen. And that's why it says here that as far as the people were concerned, that God had confirmed that Samuel was a prophet of the Lord, because whenever Samuel would say something in the name of the Lord, it would come to pass. And so the fact that he just told Eli everything that was going to happen is going to come to pass. And when it does, then people are going to understand that God is talking to Samuel. But I want you to understand this also. Samuel, you might say, was a new prophet. He was, if you want to put it like this, he was a baby prophet, or he was, just becoming a prophet. And yet, even in those prophecies, his words were 100% accurate and 100% true, because they come from God. Because when God says something, it's going to happen. Now, sometimes we don't understand what he says, and so we think it doesn't come to pass, or sometimes we want to interpret it a certain way when God meant it a different way. But when God says something, it's going to come to pass. And when God's prophets say something, it's going to come to pass. So if anybody says to you, or or of any religion or of any leader of a religion says, prophesies to you and it doesn't come to pass, then you know one thing: he's not from God. And it's really just that simple. It's not any more complicated than that. But a lot of people want to make it more complicated than that. And they want to act like because the individual does a lot of other good things, that therefore he should be believed because he's a prophet, even though some of what he said hasn't come true. But then what that implies is this: when God says something, then it fails. And so therefore, how can you believe God if he says anything? And so remember that when you talk to individuals who claim to be prophets. I've had a couple of individuals greet me and tell me that they were prophets, and yet they gave no evidence of the fact that they were, or that God was really speaking through them. Anyway, if you're a prophet, God will confirm it to you. And that's also what happened in New Testament times with those individuals who were inspired by the Holy Spirit and were given gifts. It says that God, or the Holy Spirit, confirmed those gifts for them. For example, here in Hebrews chapter 2, and down here at verse 3, in the middle of verse 3 says, after it was at the first, talking about the salvation, the great salvation, it says, after it was at the first spoken through the Lord, it was confirmed to us by those who heard, God also testifying with them both by signs and wonders and by various miracles and by gifts of the Holy Spirit. So any message that you hear, any message that you believe, any message that you think comes from God has to be confirmed by God. It has to have God's stamp on it. And so just because somebody tells you that something is from God doesn't mean it's from God. Now, if somebody has already proven to you that they're from God, if God has already manifested through this individual and confirmed an individual as being a prophet, then certainly you can listen to him and understand that he is a prophet. But if somebody just comes up to you and claims to be a prophet and there's no confirmation, then you certainly have the right to ask him to confirm it by the Lord. And that's what we have going on here. And so everybody knew that Samuel was a prophet and that God was speaking to him because his word came to pass. Now, contrast that with Eli's sons, who were not confirmed as prophets, as somebody who God was speaking through or speaking with. And so therefore you have that contrast. Now, verse 21 says, and the Lord appeared again at Shiloh, because the Lord revealed himself to Samuel at Shiloh by the word of the Lord. Now, Shiloh is where the ark is and is where the temple is. And therefore, God is now communicating to Samuel at Shiloh. So the idea is that if you'd like to know something from God during this time when there was such wickedness in Israel, that you could come to Samuel at Shiloh and he could probably help you or give you a word from the Lord. And so that's the idea of he appeared again at Shiloh. In other words, the Lord finally found somebody at Shiloh that he could work through, or that would be faithful to his calling. And so God was willing to work with him or through him. God was willing to do whatever was necessary to him. And so God was again communicating with individuals at Shiloh, but it wasn't because Eli was there. It was because Samuel was there. Now, let's see some of the fulfillment of this, because really this verse here in verse 20, where it says all Israel from Dan to Beersheba knew that Samuel was confirmed as a prophet, really follows what happens in chapter 4, because in chapter 4, you have the fulfillment of what God said. And so that's how they would know that Samuel was a true prophet, because when his words come to pass, then they would know that it was true. And that's what you have in chapter 4. So chapter 4 is really telling us how the people of Israel knew that Samuel was a true prophet of God. Now, verse 1, 1 Samuel 4. It says, thus the word of Samuel came to all Israel. came to all Israel. Thus the word of Samuel came to all Israel. Now Israel went out to meet the Philistines in battle and camped beside Ebenezer, while the Philistines camped at Apex. The Philistines drew up in battle array to meet Israel. When the battle spread, Israel was defeated before the Philistines, who killed about 4,000 men on the battlefield. When the people came into the camp, the elders of Israel said, "Why has the Lord defeated us today before the Philistines? Let us take to ourselves from Shiloh the ark of the covenant of the Lord, that it may come among us and deliver us from the power of our enemies." So the people sent to Shiloh, and from there they carried the ark of the covenant to the Lord. The ark of the covenant of the Lord of hosts, who sits above the cherubim, and the two sons of Eli, Hophni and Phinehas, were there with the ark of the covenant of God. As the ark of the covenant of God came into the camp, all Israel shouted with a great shout, so that the earth resounded. When the Philistines heard the noise of the shout, they said, "What does the noise of this great shout in the camp of the Hebrews mean?" Then they understood that the ark of the Lord had come into the camp. The Philistines were afraid, for they said, "God has come into the camp." And they said, "Woe to us, for nothing like this has happened before. Woe to us, who shall deliver us from the hand of this mighty God, these mighty gods? These are the gods who smote the Egyptians with all kinds of plagues in the wilderness. Take courage and be men, O Philistines, or you will become slaves to the Hebrews as they have been slaves to you. Therefore, be men and fight." So the Philistines fought with it, and Israel was defeated, and every man fled to his tent. And the slaughter was very great, for there fell of Israel 30,000 foot soldiers. And the ark of God was taken, and the two sons of Eli, Hophni and Phinehas, died. And so here we have part of this fulfillment of what God had told Samuel in his dream. But I want you to notice something as we go through. Now, the word of the Lord is coming to Samuel. Eli knows that the word of the Lord is coming to Samuel. Eli knows that Samuel is in communication with God, and God is talking to Samuel. And it's interesting that it says in verse 1, as it starts this section, "Thus the word of Samuel came to all Israel." And so the idea of "thus the word of Samuel came to all Israel" is that Samuel, they knew, were speaking for God. But then it says, "Now Israel went out to meet the Philistines in battle and camped beside Ebenezer, while the Philistines camped in Apex." Now here's what I think is interesting. What I think is interesting is God is now talking to Samuel, and yet it seems that they don't come to Samuel and ask Samuel to ask God if they should go out to battle and fight against the Philistines. We have no idea why they're fighting this battle with the Philistines, other than the fact that in the course of this conversation, we do know that the Philistines had subjugated Israel. And again, remember that subjugation happens whenever Israel becomes unfaithful. When Israel is unfaithful, God allows them to be subjugated by one of the nations that remained in the land of Canaan that they were supposed to destroy. And so there's this battle going on, but you never see them, you never hear Israel going to Samuel and saying, "Hey, can you ask God if we should go into battle with the Philistines and whether it's going to work out for us?" You don't see that. Now, I would suggest that whenever you have a major decision that you're going to make, that you ask God. And you might say, "Well, what do you mean you ask God?" Well, that means you ask God, "What would you want me to do?" And then you go to the Word of God and you look. And you look and see if you can find passages that deal with what it is that you're talking about, whether it's how to spend your money, whether it's how to raise your children, whether it's how to treat your wife, whether it's what you can eat if you're trying to figure out whether you can eat pork or not. Then go to the Word of God and ask God. Let God communicate with you what He wants you to do, because that information is in there. Now, some things don't matter. And when we look for those things, and if they don't matter, you won't find them, and therefore you can do whatever you'd like to do. Like, for example, if you decide that you want to be that you want to start work, and so you're looking for a job, and you ask God, what job should I have? God's word says it can be anything. Take any job you want. You can be a plumber, you can be an electrician, you can be a brain surgeon, you could, whatever. There's no place in the scripture where it says that a Christian has to become a, quote, a clergy, and I'm only using that because I want to say preacher, but I want us to understand that all Christians should be preaching or talking to people, but not all of them have to be paid preachers in order to make a living. And so we need to ask God. God needs to be part of our life, and communicating with God needs to be something that we do. And you'll see this again in this section here in just a minute. Now, verse 2 says, the Philistines drew up in battle array to meet Israel. In other words, they formed their battle lines as they did when they fought back then. And it says, when the battle spread, Israel was defeated before the Philistines, who killed about 4,000 men on the battlefield. So basically what happened was that they all line up and they fight, and Israel basically loses 4,000 men that day. And so they return back to their camp because battles or conflicts didn't usually just take one day. It generally took a number of days for things to work out. And so on the first day, they lost 4,000 men. And so they gathered themselves together. In verse 3, it says, when the people came into the camp, the elders of Israel said, why has the Lord defeated us today before the Philistines? Let us take to ourselves from Shiloh the ark of the covenant of the Lord, that it may come among us and deliver us from the power of our enemies. Now, I want you to notice again, as I mentioned in verse 1, notice again that here it says, when the people came into the camp, the elders of Israel said. Now, again, they come to the elders, and the elders are supposed to be the leaders. And if you're a leader of a spiritual group and you have a decision to make, the very first thing you should do is talk to God about it. But yet we find out that these elders, it doesn't mention that when the people came and said, look, we're defeated, what do you think we ought to do? It doesn't say the elders said, well, let's ask God. And let's ask Samuel and see if Samuel can maybe help us, since God's talking through Samuel. Maybe we can get Samuel and he can help us. But you don't see that. What you see is the elders who have been ruling and who have been leading the people. And by the way, that's the reason why Israel is having those problems, because they didn't have good leaders, and they were following the leaders instead of following God. And so what happens is that when the people came to the camp, they talked to the people who should lead them properly. And those people who should lead them answer was, why has the Lord defeated us today before the Philistines? In other words, why has this happened? But they never asked God about it. And then it says, so here's their conclusion. Let us take to ourselves from Shiloh the ark of the covenant of the Lord, that he may come among us and deliver us from the power of our enemies. So here you see one of the problems with Israel and in their relationship with God. And that is that they thought God was a relic. Now, you know what a relic is? A relic is a religious object that is supposed to have some kind of power or some kind of force in order to accomplish what you want accomplished. Sometimes people use, lucky rabbit's feet. Now, they're not necessarily relics because it's not a religious thing, but they're like a relic from the standpoint that people sometimes put their faith in those things. But it wasn't very, very comforting for the rabbit that lost a foot. But nonetheless, you understand what I mean. It says that the attitude of the elders was, let's use the relic of God. Let's use that relic that has the power, and therefore that power will be with us. God will be with us. So Israel saw God in the relic. They saw God in that Ark of the Covenant. Now, here's what we need to remember also. Certainly, that Ark of the Covenant represents God. But you and I know today that God doesn't dwell in temples made by hands, and God doesn't dwell in a box. That box can't fit in. That ark that they have, God doesn't live in that ark. So it's not like you take the ark out there and God's going to live in there. It's not like Indiana Jones where they lift the ark and, angels come out. I guess their angels came out and killed everybody that looked into it. That's not the way it works. It's not that the box contains God and contains angels and contains, religious beings, but it's that God used it as a representation. But the elders looked at it as if it was a relic, as if that's what's going to defeat us. Is we have the relic, we have this thing that belongs to God, and since it belongs to God, God is going to fight for us. And so it says in verse 3, let us take to ourselves from Shiloh the ark of the covenant of the Lord, that it may come among us and deliver us from the power of our enemies. Now notice that it says that it may come among us and deliver us from the power of our enemies. So they're putting their faith in that object instead of putting their faith in the Lord. And sometimes people do that. They'll put their faith in their church, or they'll put their faith in some preacher, or they'll put their faith in the cross. And I know that when I was a Catholic, that you had all kinds of saint, medallions that you could buy. You could buy medallions of a saint that's supposed to guard you from evil. You're supposed to that guard you from sin. You can get a saint medal that's supposed to help your animals. He's the saint of the animals. And so you get all these different saints medallions, and they're supposed to keep you from evil. And that's the same kind of nonsense as you have going on here. So Israel doesn't have leaders that understand their relationship with God. And so no wonder they're having difficulties. And so it says that it may come among us and deliver us from the power of our enemies. Now, verse 4. So the people sent to Shiloh, and from there they carried the ark of the covenant of the Lord of hosts, who sits above the cherubim, and the two sons of Eli, Hophni and Phinehas, were there with the ark of the covenant of God. Now, you would think that if they decided to take the ark, that Eli might say something, and maybe he did, and maybe his sons, Eli and Hophni, took it anyway. We don't have that conversation when the elders went and asked for the Ark of the Covenant to be taken out of the tabernacle where it was supposed to stay. We don't have that conversation, but it seems kind of weird that they allowed it to come out of the ark, out of the tabernacle, since that's where God was at. Okay, but we might get a little bit more insight into this as we read it a little bit further. But just think about that, if you would, about them actually getting the Ark of the Covenant and the Ark of the Covenant actually coming out to them. And it says that Eli and Phinehas were the ones who were bringing it. And that's because it had to be carried by Levites. It couldn't be carried on a cart. It couldn't be carried by other men. It had to be carried by priests. And so Hophni and Phinehas were the ones who were carrying the Ark of the Covenant of God. Now, the other thing I want you to notice in this little section here, how many times the word covenant is used. I find that interesting. That he says down here in verse 4. So the people sent to Shiloh, and from there they carried the Ark of the Covenant, that's one time, of the hosts, and who sits above the cherubim, and the two sons of Eli, Phinehas and Hophni, were there for the Ark of the Covenant of God. As the Ark of the Covenant of God, there it is 4 times, came into the camp, and all Israel shouted, so the earth resounded. And so you have this idea that it's the Ark of the Covenant of the Lord, the Ark of the Covenant of the Lord, the Ark of the Covenant of the Lord. Well, the covenant had 2 sides. The covenant of God was an agreement that God made with Israel. You obey me, and I will bless you. I will take care of you. That was God's covenant. And so this was the Ark of the Covenant. This was the representation of the covenant, you might say. And of course, the representation of the covenant that you and I understand is representing Jesus. Because that ark had the mercy seat, and it had the angels that were on the mercy seat. That was basically the cover for the ark. So the ark was basically the box that had the manna and Aaron's rod that budded, and at one time the 10 Commandments. I'm not sure what's in it at this time, but that was supposed to be in it. And then it had the mercy seat, that was the cover, that had two angels on it that were looking down into the box. And that's where the high priest would put the blood in order for God not to punish Israel or to pay for their sins. And that's the covenant. It's the Ark of the Covenant. In other words, it represents the covenant. God's going to forgive them for their sins. But they somehow thought it was just some kind of relic, some religious object that had some power. And so we're going to bring it out because it's the covenant, it's the agreement that God has with us. The agreement wasn't if you carry this ark out that it's going to defeat your enemies. That wasn't the agreement. The agreement was that if you're faithful to God, God's going to forgive you for your sins. God's going to bless you and take care of you. And so they brought out the ark of the Lord, who of hosts, who sits above the cherubim. The idea of sitting above the cherubim is that the mercy seat, God was over the mercy seat, over the cherubim. And the two sons of Eli, Hophni and Phinehas, they were the priests, were there with the ark of the covenant of God. And so it was this covenant of God that they were depending on as they brought out the ark. Now remember, there's two sides to the covenant. God is faithful to his side of the covenant, but man has to be faithful to his side. And so it says in verse 5, as the ark of the covenant of the Lord came into the camp, all Israel shouted with a great shout. So the earth resounded. So the idea is we're getting this relic among us, and therefore we're going to have this supernatural power now that we didn't have before, because they have placed God into a box. They have taken God and they have put him in this box, this ark, and therefore, since the ark is now with them, they're going to be able to defeat the enemy, because God wasn't with them before, because the ark wasn't there. The ark had been in Shiloh. On the first day they did battle and lost 4,000 people. But now the ark is going to be with them, and so God's going to be with them, because God apparently is in this box. And if you bring the box closer, then you bring God closer. And they fail to understand God, and they fail to understand the purpose for the Ark of the Covenant. And it says, it says in verse 6, when the Philistines heard the noise of the shout, they said, what does the noise of this great shout in the camp of the Hebrews mean? Then they understood that the ark of the Lord had come into the camp. And so the Philistines figured out that the reason for all this noise and all their excitement in the camp of Israel is because they brought the ark of God into the camp. And so remember that the Philistines were pagan. The Philistines were idolaters. And so they looked at their God as if it was some object. And so therefore, when they heard that the ark of God was in the camp, they became afraid. And look at verse 7. It says, the Philistines were afraid, for they said, God is coming to the camp. And they said, woe is us, for nothing like this has happened before. So apparently this was the first time that the Ark of the Covenant was brought out into a battle. And they were kind of worried. And the reason they were worried is verse 8 says, woe to us, who shall deliver us from the hand of these mighty gods? These are the gods who smote the Egyptians with all kinds of plagues in the wilderness. Now, notice that they use the plural gods. And they use the plural gods because that's the way they viewed their gods. They had a plurality of gods. And so now Israel's getting its gods and bringing its gods. And they said, and these gods are powerful because they smote the Egyptians with all kinds of plagues in the wilderness. Now, here's what I want you to understand. That event happened some almost 400 years earlier, and really almost closer to 500 years earlier. So that story had been told over and over and over and over, and been handed down and told as tradition. And the Philistines had heard those stories, and so they believed them. And so they were afraid when they heard that the ark of God was there, because they also had this idea of gods live in certain objects. And so now that the object is close by, God's going to be there instead of God being the God of the whole world. And so they said, that these gods are the ones who brought those plagues on Egypt and the plagues in the wilderness and the different events that happened when Israel was delivered out of Egyptian captivity and wandered in the wilderness for 40 years. They heard about all that stuff. And so they believed it. Now, here's what they were commanded to do. Verse 9 it says, take courage and be men, O Philistines, or you will become slaves to the Hebrews as they have been slaves to you. Therefore, be men and fight. So basically, the Philistines said, we're going to have to fight even though their God is here. Because if we don't, then we're going to become slaves. So it's kind of like either freedom or death is kind of what they're doing. It's also interesting that they don't go off and follow the God who did all this to the Hebrews that they believed was now in the court of Israel. And one of the reasons for that was because they had, during that time, they had what were referred to as national gods. Each nation had its own gods, and each nation having its own gods would follow those gods because they were part of that nation. And so that's kind of what you have going on here today. I'm sorry, it's what you have going on here with the Philistines. So even though they thought that the gods of Israel were apparently more powerful since they did all this stuff to the Egyptians, they still weren't going to go down there because they were Philistines, and the Philistines had their own God. And the Philistines, were loyal basically to their national God, you might say, as Israel was supposed to be to theirs. But let's see what happens. It says in verse 10, so the Philistines fought, and Israel was defeated, and every man fled to his tent. And the slaughter was very great, for there fell of Israel 30,000 foot soldiers. So they went ahead and fought again. And this time when they fought, Israel was really defeated. They lost 30,000 men. So that's 34,000 men in all that they lost, that they lost in this war. And so they were defeated. And it says in verse 11, and the ark of God was taken. So the Philistines captured the God of Israel. They captured the relic. And the two sons of Eli, Hophni and Phinehas, died. So apparently, Eli's sons were either killed or God caused them to die somehow in some way. And so as these events happened, then all of Israel would know that Samuel was a prophet of God, because Samuel predicted some of these things, and he predicted that they were going to happen. And so when that predicted, he prophesied that they were going to happen. He told that to Eli when Eli asked him, "What did God say to you?" Excuse me. What did God say to you? And that's what he said. That's what he had done. It says, so the Philistines fought, and Israel was defeated. The ark was taken, and the two sons of Eli, Hophni and Phinehas, died. And so they were supposed to die in the same day, and they did. Now, in verse 12, it says, now, verse 12, now a man of Benjamin ran from the battle line and came to Shiloh the same day with his clothes torn and dust on his head. And when he came, behold, Eli was sitting on his seat by the road, eagerly watching, because his heart was trembling for the ark of God. So the man came to tell it in the city, and all the city cried out. When Eli heard the noise of the outcry, he said, what does the noise of this commotion mean? Then the man came hurriedly and told Eli. Now Eli was 98 years old, and his eyes were set so that he could not see. The man said to Eli, I am the one who came from the battle line. Indeed, I escaped from the battle line today. And he said, how did things go, my son? Then the one who brought the news replied, Israel has fled before the Philistines, and there has also been a great slaughter among the people. And your two sons also, Hophni and Phinehas, are dead, and the ark of God has been taken. When he mentioned the ark of God, Eli fell off the seat backward beside the gate, and his neck was broken, and he died, for he was old and heavy. Thus he judged Israel 40 years. Now I'm going to go ahead and stop there, see if we can get this much done before our time ends. So the battle ends, and so there's a man from Benjamin who runs from the battle line, and he comes to Shiloh the same day with his clothes torn and dust on his head. Now, this torn clothes and dust on their heads was a sign of mourning. And so he's mourning because they lost. And so he comes to the town, Shiloh, in order to inform everybody what's going on. Verse 13 says, when he came, behold, Eli was sitting on his seat by the road, eagerly watching. So Eli was sitting, waiting for news. So he's close to the entrance of the city, you might say, in his seat, and he's waiting because he wants to hear. Now, I want you to notice this part. He says, because his heart was trembling for the ark of God. So remember I told you that it was interesting that when they wanted the ark of God, it just says they took it. It's possible that Eli had said to them that the ark shouldn't be taken, but they took it anyway. And that's why Eli was trembling and concerning the ark. He was afraid of what might happen to the ark because they had taken it. And so it's possible that Eli tried to stop them. I don't know. But Eli's sons, Hophni and Phinehas, would have done whatever they wanted to do anyway. And so they're the ones that took the ark. But it's interesting that he's trembling and worried about the ark of God. And it says, so the man came and told the city. And of course, the city, when they heard, they were all crying and they were all upset. And when Eli heard all the noise, he wanted to know what was going on and what the commotion meant. And so the man hurried to go talk to Eli, because Eli was, as it says here, 98 years old, and his eyes were dim, had cataracts and couldn't see. And so the man said to Eli, I am the one who came from the battle lines. Indeed, I escaped from the battle line today. In other words, when he says I escaped, that tells you that things weren't going well. In other words, he managed to save his life while other people were being killed in the battle line. And so he left. And so Eli asked him how he was doing, how things went. And so the man said in verse 17, then the one who brought the news replied, Israel has fled before the Philistines. So Israel has been defeated. And there's also been a great slaughter among the people. Remember, 30,000 men, foot soldiers, died. And your two sons, also Hophni and Phinehas, are dead. So Hophni and Phinehas died while they had the ark out there. And not only that, but the ark of God has been taken. So Israel fell. There was a great slaughter. Eli's sons died, and the ark was taken. How much worse could it get? How much worse could it be? And so it says in verse 18, when he mentioned the ark of God, Eli fell off the seat backwards beside the gate, and his neck was broken, and he died. For he was old and heavy, and thus he judged Israel 40 years. Now, what I find interesting in this is certainly, of course, that Eli was overcome with, fainting or whatever it was. But it says that Eli fell off his seat backwards. So he was beside the gate. And so when they told him, he kind of pushed back on his seat, you might say, and as people often do. And he fell off of it and fell backwards. And it says that he broke his neck. And one of the reasons he broke his neck was because he was heavy. Now, if you remember, it said that he used to like to eat the meat that his sons got when they made the people give them raw meat to eat with the fat. And so maybe that's why Eli didn't correct his sons too bad, because he liked that meat. And anyway, it says that he was heavy and he was old. So he was fat and he was old, and he ended up breaking his neck and dying. And so what Eli, the Lord had told Samuel was starting to happen. And thus, all Israel would know that Samuel was a prophet from God. But it says, thus he judged Israel 40 years. And that, of course, has reference to Eli, that Eli there, and Eli served God for 40 years. In other words, throughout his generation. Now, let's see if we can't get the rest of this done here. Verse 19. It says, now his daughter-in-law, Phinehas's wife, was pregnant and about to give birth. And when she heard the news that the ark of God was taken and that her father-in-law and her husband had died, she kneeled down and gave birth, for her pains came upon her. And about the time of her death, the woman who stood by her said to her, do not fear, for you have given birth to a son. But she did not answer or pay attention. And she called the boy Ichabod, saying, the glory has departed from Israel, because the ark of God was taken, and because her father-in-law and her husband. She said, the glory has departed from Israel. So for the ark of God was taken. So here you have Phinehas's wife, who is Eli's daughter-in-law, and apparently she was pregnant, and it was close to the time she was going to give birth. And it says, when she heard the news about the ark of God was taken, and her father-in-law and her husband had died, that she knelt down and she gave birth. So as soon as she heard these traumatic events, it caused her to go into labor and have contractions, and she gave birth because her pain had come. In other words, her contractions started because of the agony of what she heard. And it says that apparently the birth wasn't very good or wasn't normal, because she ended up dying. It says about the time of her death, and we're certainly assuming that's from the birth, that the woman who stood by her said, do not be afraid, for you have given birth to a son. In other words, as she's giving birth, she's about ready to expire and die. And the midwife is telling her, well, don't be afraid, because at least you're going to give birth to a son, and the son is coming. But it says, but she did not answer or pay attention. And no doubt that's because of her deep mourning and loss. And it says in verse 21, and she called the boy Ichabod, saying, the glory has departed from Israel. So the word Ichabod means glory is departed. The Lord's glory has departed. So she called her son Ichabod because the Lord's glory has departed, because the ark of God was taken and because of her father-in-law and her husband. So the high priest died, the high priest's sons died, the ark had been taken, and Phinehas's wife died as she gave birth. And so the child that was born was called Ichabod. And she called the boy Ichabod, saying, the glory has departed from the Lord, because the ark of God was taken, and because her father-in-law and her husband. Now, again, notice that they're equating the glory of the Lord with the ark of the covenant, with the ark of God. Well, the ark of God represents God, but it's not the glory of the Lord. The glory of the Lord is God. God's the glory. God is his own glory. The ark is nothing more than a representation or a symbol for God, and it was taken. But she's true from the standpoint that it's truth from the standpoint that the glory of the Lord was taken, because God was not with Israel. And so God wasn't with Israel. But it's not because the ark was taken, it's because they didn't keep their part of the covenant. And so therefore God, who is faithful to his covenant, was punishing them as his covenant demands, and as he had told them that he would do in his covenant. And so that the ark of God was taken, and because of her father-in-law and her husband. So basically what you have is the religious symbolism of Israel had been taken and taken away. And so now what was Israel going to do without their God is kind of the picture that you get here. They can't offer sacrifice because they don't have the tabernacle. I'm sorry, they don't have the Ark of the Covenant. They can't offer the Passover lamb and and they can't sprinkle the blood, and they can't do any of those things. And the people who were able to do it, they died too. And so basically the religion died and was taken captive by another country is what you have. And so verse 22 says, and she said, the glory has departed from Israel, for the ark of God was taken. So no ark, According to them, no glory. And so therefore, Israel had departed. But yet, in all of this, God was still communicating with Samuel, because Samuel was faithful to God and faithful to the covenant of God, and therefore God and his glory was still dealing with them through Samuel. So remember, God deals with his people who are faithful to him, and he accomplishes for those who are faithful to him what he promised to give them and to take care of them and to bless them. And he will defeat our enemies if you're faithful to him. So it is the Ark of the Covenant, or the covenant of God, but it represents God. God's in heaven. The relics that people use are not God. They might represent God to them, but they're not God. They have no glory in and of themselves in that particular relic. And so don't make other things the relic. Don't make your religion the relic. God's in heaven, and the Bible teaches us how to have a relationship with God, and having a relationship with God makes us God's church, makes us the one church that Jesus built. Jesus built only one church, and all those people that have a relationship with Jesus are part of that one church, and who are following him are part of that one church and have a relationship with him, and they are the temple of God that we certainly understand is the post tabernacle. In other words, the tabernacle was turned into the temple, and the temple became a physical representation of the tabernacle. And so God's church today is his tabernacle, is his temple. And so God dwells in his people. And again, those that are faithful to him. Some of the people of God might not have the glory of God with them. In other words, have the presence of God with them. That doesn't mean that God has deserted his people. Just like here, the nation of Israel thought they lost their God, but yet Samuel, who was a part of Israel, had God, and God spoke through Samuel, and the people could have a relationship with God through Samuel. And so that's what we have in this chapter. I pray the Lord has blessed you for being here, and pray he continues to bless you as you continue your studies to learn more about God.